Thank you for tuning into the first episode of Forno and Forum. Quick introduction before we get into today's recipe. My name's Nat, and I've been cooking since I was about probably 15 years old, and the focus of this channel is going to be the recipes that I grew up on, which were taught to me by my mother. So it's going to focus on a lot of traditional Italian style recipes, as well as some American and other cultures recipes that I've learned along the way. So hopefully you like and subscribe to the channel, but that's kind of what you have to look forward to. A lot of Italian-American dishes, traditional Italian stuff, and then occasionally perhaps some barbecue along the way as well. Without further ado, we're going to get into today's episode, which is the recipe that started it all, which is my mother's pasta sauce. So we're going to go right over here real quick and kind of go over the ingredients. A lot of things that I cook are going to involve some olive oil. This recipe will also include garlic. And before we get too far, in the description of the video below, we will have the recipe detailed out step by step as far as ingredients and the process as well. So don't worry if I'm speaking too fast or going through too quickly. You will have the instructions below in the description. So garlic goes into the sauce as well. 1 6-ounce can of tomato paste, and then 1 28-ounce can of crushed tomatoes. Now this part's kind of important, so it's really kind of how you like your sauce. I kind of like a mid-grade thickness, so if you want it a little bit, so with that I go 1-to-1 paste to crushed tomatoes. If you want something a little bit thinner, you can go 2-to-1 crushed tomatoes to tomato paste. If you like it a little bit thicker, you can inverse that and go 1 can of crushed tomatoes to 2 of tomato paste, and that'll make it a little bit thicker. It's really your preference. From there, you'll also have to adjust the seasonings as well. Speaking of those, we have salt, whatever your preference is, regular table salt, kosher, that's what I'm using, kosher salt. We've got fresh basil from my parents' garden. So if you have fresh basil, fantastic. If you don't, you can get it at pretty much any grocery store in the produce or herb section. Black pepper. I like my stuff a little bit spicy, so crushed red pepper. Oregano. And freshly grated Parmesan cheese. Now, the cool thing about this recipe is it's very versatile. This is my base all the time. Sometimes I get a little bit creative with it and I'll throw in some wine or some various other spices just to kind of kick it up a little bit. But this is the base structure for this recipe. And this particular recipe will operate as a Forno foundation. A lot of the other things that we'll be making will pivot off of this sauce recipe, whether it be our gnocchi from scratch, which will be used on top of this sauce will be used on top of that gnocchi, or if we do our chicken parmesan or eggplant parmesan, that will include this this sauce recipe. So if you subscribe to this channel, you will see this recipe used quite a bit for other recipes as a sauce. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it. We'll start with the olive oil. So you want to heat up your olive oil before you add the fresh cloves of garlic. And this is one other thing you'll have to note, as is the curse of Italian cooking. I don't measure when I cook. It's just based off of reflex and eyeballing. In the actual description, or the actual recipe in the description, I will include, as best as I can, the measurements for it. As far as the olive oil, this is probably about a good, maybe tablespoon and half a tablespoon perhaps that went into it, but I'll do my best to detail that in the description area where you'll find the recipe. You want your olive oil to heat up a little bit. Typically I use 2 to 3 cloves of garlic for the recipe, and then as is typical, we smash it, which helps remove the outer covering of the garlic, which you don't want to consume. All right. And then as far as the garlic goes, you can do this a couple different ways. You can either leave the garlic in as the entire cook goes on, or once it browns, you can take it out and discard the garlic. Again, it's one of those things where it's really your preference. The way my mom always made this growing up, none of us really, well, my parents, my sisters didn't really like the garlic, finding the garlic in the pasta as they're eating. So that was, she would usually take it out just for the preference of the family, but it really comes up to you. If you don't mind chomping down on a piece of garlic as you're eating your pasta or your chicken parm, you're fine. You can leave it in. So like I said, you just want to cook the garlic so that it's nice and browned. Saute it essentially. You don't want to burn the garlic because that's going to make your base very bitter. So you want to kind of be cognizant and keep an eye on this. Yeah, this recipe has been used for pretty much everything in my family, from lasagnas to stuffed shells, just basic pasta on a regular weekday night. It's a base structure for just about everything. Eventually we'll do a vodka sauce episode, and this sauce will be the base structure for that when you transform the marinara sauce to vodka sauce. So this will operate as the base for that. Right. So you can already see that the garlic is starting to brown a little bit. Maybe I'll let it go a little bit further, and then these guys will come out, because like I said, I don't want them to burn. You just want the flavor of the garlic to be infused into the oil. Now just please take note, when we add in the tomato paste and the crushed tomatoes, that there's going to be splatter. So you probably get some splattered tomatoes on your stove and potentially your clothes. So if you have a problem with that, wear an apron. That'll help you out with that. So the first thing that I put in is the tomato paste. It'll add a nice base to it, and then we'll add in the crushed tomatoes later. Yeah, so the splatter's already happening. It's fun. So as the oil splatters, you're going to get a little bit burned, because I was not paying attention. Should have lowered the heat a little bit, but it all works out. It's all fun. Eventually it kind of starts to relax a little bit. You want to make sure you spread the tomato paste around your pot, and that'll kind of help calm things down a little bit as the oil incorporates with the paste. And then once we get the crushed tomatoes in there, it kind of calms things down a little bit more as well. At this point, I don't put any seasonings in yet. Usually I save the addition of the seasonings until the paste and crushed tomatoes are all in the pot. This way it's a uniform flavor. I don't want to salt it with the paste and then salt it again and end up with an issue where it's being over salted by chance. Okay, so when we're starting to get this kind of a consistency with the paste, you're pretty much okay to add in the crushed tomatoes and kind of move on to the next stage of the sauce. And as you add in the crushed tomatoes, and I think I just got some on myself, you're bound to get some splashback and get splattered with the crushed tomatoes a little bit. So now you just want to incorporate the tomato paste and the crushed tomatoes till they're about uniform, so they're kind of mixed together nicely. And then once they start to get mixed together, the next part, I'm going to see if I can do this, if I can actually reach all the way to the sink. But you want to take your can or cans of crushed tomatoes, depending on how large of a batch you're doing, or if you're doing a 2-to-1 ratio. You want to take those cans of crushed tomatoes, and then you want to rinse out the sides. And I know you can't see me right now, but I've gone over to our sink, and you want to kind of rinse off any remnants on the sides. And then kind of do a little bit of a swirl to loosen up any of the remaining bits of crushed tomatoes within the can. And then it's, as you can see, it's about half full, maybe little bit under half. Add that to your sauce. Again, this will impact your thickness to thinness ratio too. So if you want it a little bit thinner, you can add a little bit more water, or less if you want it to maintain some thickness. I also like to put a little bit of water in the tomato paste can to kind of scrape off any of the additional tomato paste on there as well. So this one I go all the way to the top because it'll help kind of slosh around the bits of tomato paste that are stuck on the side. All right, you just want to incorporate that again so that the crushed tomatoes, the tomato paste, and the water that you've added from the cans are about are fully incorporated. So if you're keeping track to this point, we've got about a tablespoon and a half of olive oil, 3 cloves of garlic, and then we've got a 20-ounce can of crushed tomatoes, a 6-ounce can of tomato paste, and then we've got 6-ounce can of water from the tomato paste can, and then about half of the 28-ounce, about 14 ounces of the can of water from the crushed tomatoes. So you want to get this nice and incorporated. The first thing that I season it with, again the order doesn't really matter so much, but I leave the salt for last, and there's a specific reason for that. I put Parmesan cheese in my my sauce, which has salt content to it as well. So I want the salt from the cheese to incorporate with the black pepper, the crushed red pepper, the oregano, and the basil to kind of start to marinate a little bit in the sauce already. And then I'll take a taste, and then from there it'll give me an idea of how much salt I need to add depending on what the salt content is of the Parmesan cheese that I'm using. And speaking of tasting, it's actually one of the most important parts to cooking, whether it's sauce, whether it's a dressing, a pasta, or whatever you're making. You got to taste along the way, and not just taste, but you have to like keep an eye out for what your preference is, because if I were to try to cook to your preference, I'd always kind of come up short, and then you would end up not liking it, and then I wouldn't like it, and we don't have a good dish. But if you cook to what your preference is in terms of flavor, whether it's the types of seasonings you're using or the heat that you're using, if you cook to your taste, it'll always be correct because you like it. And then at least, you know, someone may or may not like your style, but that is what it is, but at least you know that it's done correctly to your taste. So I start with just a little bit of black pepper. I kind of go a little bit heavy on the crushed red pepper. If you don't want the crushed red pepper, you can omit this. So right now it's probably a good tablespoon of crushed red pepper, and then it was probably a teaspoon or so of black pepper. The next ingredient that goes in a little bit on the heavy side is oregano, and this happens quite a bit in Italian cooking, at least in our house. There's usually oregano in just about everything. This is probably gonna be a good heaping tablespoon of oregano. And then once I get those 3 primaries in, I give it a good stir just to get those guys incorporated into the sauce. And also, you don't want anything really, you don't want it to stick at the bottom. So stirring is very important with this particular recipe, because if it sticks, it burns, and that's going to impact your flavor. Drop my cheese grater, so I have to give this guy a wash real quick. This is a really simple recipe. There are more complicated red sauce recipes out there, which will eventually be on the channel, but this is a utility one. There are certain ones where, you know, my mom will put sausage in the sauce, or some kind of like pork stew kind of meat. should also put like some beef chunks in there on occasion. You know, we've done the big, you know, ordeal of sauce with the neck bones, the pork neck bones in there. So it's a very versatile dish, and this is pretty much the base for the entire thing, and then it just pivots based on what you're doing. And as far as that, this is probably about a good third of a cup of Parmesan cheese in there. And again, all these ratios in terms of the spices and the ingredients, you can adjust based on your taste. If you want more or less cheese, by all means. If you want more or less black pepper, absolutely. If you prefer it a little bit spicier, rock on. I'll be right there with you. I love me some spicy food. So at this point, usually I add in about a good 3 leaves for a pot this size of basil. I'll go in a 4th just in case, but that should suffice. So about a pot this size, you're looking at about 4 leaves of basil. No need to chop them up. They'll just leave them in the sauce to kind of incorporate their flavor in there. Now you might be noticing a thing that you may have, this is curious. I've seen other sauce recipes where people put sugar in there, etc. Never experienced that once growing up with my family. So I mean, you know, and it's the beauty of cooking. You cook how you want. If you want sugar in your sauce, by all means. We don't do that in our house. So at this point, flavor spot on. The cheese wasn't very salty, so I'll need to accommodate accordingly regarding the actual salt that goes in. And the sauce, you don't want to be, or the salt, you don't want to be too liberal with it. You want it to just kind of like zing your tongue a little bit, where it kind of helps the other ingredients in the recipe kind of shine a little bit. So it's not the focus, it's more of an enhancer for the other ingredients. A little bit more and we should be good. That'll probably end up being a good, probably a good teaspoon, maybe 2 teaspoons of salt. Again, do a little bit, taste it, and then if it's where you like it, leave it. But if you need to add some more, add some more. That's it. Cooking is very fluid. Like I said, in my family, we never really grew up with measuring stuff out. Hopefully I can develop a gauge for that as this channel goes on, and I will definitely try to do that for you. Yep, so that's good. As far as salt content, like I said, it's about a teaspoon to 2 teaspoons, roughly. So currently, we're looking at this in terms of a consistency as far as the sauce. It's gonna cook for about 30 minutes. So this, again, this is not one of those big Sunday ordeals where this guy is gonna cook for about 4 hours kind of a thing. It's not really necessary. I've made those before. I made that for my girlfriend with neck bones and sausage and stuff, and that was a big 4 or 5 hour cook, so that you need the meat to get tender and reduced down, right? But for this is just like if you're wanting to make a small portion of pasta for your meal, if you're having like salad and some other type of protein, this will be ready for you in about 30 minutes. So from here, we want to bring the sauce up to not a boil, but as it starts to kind of barely break the surface, that's kind of the heat level you want it. Once it gets there, you kind of want to lower the heat and let it just continue to simmer for about 30 minutes or so. That'll allow the thickness to get to the proper thickness, for lack of a better term, and then you will be ready to go. Now again, this episode is not going to focus on putting the sauce on a specific type of pasta. It's literally just the recipe for the sauce. Like I said, this particular recipe will pivot into a lot of things that we do on this particular channel. It'll pivot for our eggplant parmesan, which should be coming up soon. It'll pivot for our chicken parmesan. It'll pivot when we make our gnocchi from scratch. Also, down the road, we'll eventually be doing an episode on pizza. The base ingredients, for the most part, remain the same. Obviously, we don't cook the sauce in advance for pizza. It cooks when it's in the oven, but the base structure for it remains the same. So right now I'm gonna let this guy come up to temp. And while that does that, just kind of go over a little bit of history for myself and my family. So like a lot of these recipes, like I mentioned earlier, are gonna be influenced based off of things that my mom has done, my dad has done, my sisters, my aunts, my grandparents. That's where a lot of the influence comes in for the recipes that we'll be making. So to give you a little background on my family, my sisters and I are actually first generation born here in the States. My parents, my mom specifically, came here in 1958 when she was 13. So she was literally off the boat. Came here on an actual boat from the Calabria region of Italy, and brought a lot of, obviously that's where the influence for our cooking comes from, which is southern Italy. So occasionally there's a lot of fish, and contrary to the rest of Italy, there tends to be a little bit more spice in the southern regions of Italy, specifically Calabria. And this particular recipe, she got it from her mom and then taught it to my sisters and myself, and we've all made various versions of this particular sauce. And I have it on record, and now it'll be on YouTube record, that my brother-in-law has told me in quiet that my sauce, this particular recipe, is the closest that it's gotten to what my mom has made. So I take that as pretty high marks, considering that my mom's is probably the best that I've had. And if you guys ever get the opportunity to taste it, it'll be the best that you have. So this is runner-up to that. I'll take it. So right now, this is what I was talking about. It's like a light simmer in the pot. I'm not sure if you can quite see it. Once it gets here, you want to kind of keep that simmer going for a good 30 minutes. Cover it, and then sporadically you can stir, like I said, to make sure that nothing is sticking. But in about 30 minutes, you will have freshly made sauce from crushed tomatoes, tomato paste, crushed red pepper, black pepper, oregano, some basil, salt, and Parmesan cheese. Again, occasionally, like I said, I throw some wine in there to kind of spice it up a little bit. But I want to say thank you for taking the time to watch this episode. Hopefully the recipe works out for you. I'd love if you guys would return back if you decide to make the recipe. Tell me how it turned out. Any modifications that you made for your particular preference. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you throw a like down there at the bottom and subscribe, because there'll be other recipes coming up as well. But thank you for tuning into this first episode of Forno and Forum. We hope to have a lot more content coming on for you. And in the meantime, enjoy this fresh pot of sauce with friends, family, and loved ones at your dinner table. Thank you.